Welcome to this wonderful history festival. While I've never advocated thinking about history as an escape from the world, I know that it feels wonderful to remember that there's more to the human experience than pandemic. And because of that, I'm not even going to talk about disease like smallpox or scurvy, although I write about both of them in The Boston Massacre, A Family History. Instead, I want to give you a little taste of my book, what it's about, how I wrote it, and especially why I think of the Boston Massacre as a family story. I think of this, Paul Revere's famous engraving of the Boston Massacre, as the story we have to unlearn. It's March of 1770. We see hapless Bostonians mowed down by a phalanx of disciplined soldiers, urged on by their captain. There's lots of gore and guns, of course, and there's one woman, hands to her breast, right in the center of the crowd of innocent bystanders. We've all learned that this picture is over-the-top propaganda. Check out the Royal Customs House, renamed Butcher's Hall. But we've all focused so much on the obvious propaganda that historians and everyone else missed the real lie in Revere's engraving. It's here, in this thick white line of gun smoke that is in the center of the image. Visually, this line separates the row of disciplined red-coated soldiers from the crowd of terrified civilians they were slaughtering. The smoke marks the split between inhabitants on one side and soldiers on the other. This picture of two opposing sides, American and British, has always seemed so obvious that no historian ever thought to question this part of Revere's story. But the truth of the matter is that civilians and soldiers were not on opposite sides of the street at all, neither actually or figuratively. And once we stop letting Revere tell us what we can see, once we start seeing all of Boston, not just the little bit that Revere shows us, there's a whole different story of Boston lying there in plain sight. In fact, chapter 1 of my book is not about Paul Revere or the Sons of Liberty. I start instead with a woman named Jane Chambers, embarking on a troop ship in Ireland with her redcoat husband and her baby. Jane and other military wives became my guide to this new story of Boston. I found these military families all over the place once I started to look. The first one I stumbled over was in a very well-known source for the Boston Massacre, this pamphlet of depositions collected by the town of Boston after the shooting. Historians used these depositions to figure out the classic questions of the Boston Massacre. Who was standing where? Whose fault was it? Who gave the order to fire? But take a look at the very first deposition. A Bostonian deposed that in the few days before the Boston Massacre, he overheard a vicious threat. In his own home, he claimed, a soldier's wife named Eleanor Park had said, if there should be any disturbance in the town of Boston, and that if any of the people were wounded, she would take a stone in her handkerchief and beat their brains out and plunder the rebels. And I wondered, why does John William have soldiers in his house? Who was this soldier's wife? Why was she there? Who knew that soldiers even had wives back then? And then I started to learn that the 18th century British Army was a family institution that traveled with women and children. Then I discovered that when soldiers were sent to Boston in 1768 to support the royal authority, the commanding officers had a little argument with the town selectmen about where these soldiers and their hundreds of wives and children would live. The selectmen wanted them out in Boston Harbor, where there already was a military barracks. The officers and governor wanted them in the center of Boston, where they could be easily deployed to put down riots. The compromise they came to forced the army to hire warehouses, private houses, rooms in private houses, and even outbuildings to house the overflow. As a result, the troops and the townspeople found themselves living literally together. Bostonians got turned into landlords and landladies. It took some time and some research to figure out, but you can see in this map how completely soldiers' families moved into the streets of Boston. Blue squares are warehouses turned into barracks. The red dots are some of the private houses. Far from being isolated in a small circle near the town center, soldiers and their families also lived in the rooms and yards of Bostonians in every area of the town. When some 2,000 members of the army moved into a town that was only 16,000 residents in total, they sometimes found each other a little annoying. Men like Revere, who were part of the Sons of Liberty or other political groups, definitely saw the presence of troops as a military occupation. The clerk of the town meeting complained, "Boston has become a garrison town." But his complaints and those of other men are not the only way to think about troops in Boston. Instead, I'd like to suggest that we think of a very different place when we think about the term garrison town. Instead, we should remember Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Think of Lydia Bennet imagining herself at a regimental encampment. As Austen says, she saw all the glories of the camp, its tents stretched forth in beauteous uniformity of lines, crowded with the young and the gay and dazzling with scarlet. And to complete the view, she saw herself seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. The soldiers that beguiled the young women of Meryton during the Napoleonic Wars were not so different from those red-coated men who caught the eye of Boston's young women in the years before the American Revolution. In 1768, the arrival of nearly 2,000 men, many of them young and single, and all of them with a steady, if small, income, could not help but attract the attention of young women. With so many young men frequenting taverns, strolling the streets, and dropping by a neighbor's kitchen, an unmarried woman might well be able to find a husband, possibly one even living in her family's spare room. Who knew that doing laundry could be so fun? I found many examples of civilians and soldiers marrying each other, acting as godparents for each other, having children together, sometimes without marrying, running away together, even breaking out of jail together. In the year and a half before the Boston Massacre, soldiers and civilians had become neighbors. But what does that change about the Boston Massacre? It means that when Bostonians and soldiers mingled on the streets, they knew each other, often well. They did not always like each other, of course, and so when a lone sentry in the center of town on King Street grew anxious at being hassled by a crowd of Bostonians one night in early March, he called for backup. The backup that came, a handful of soldiers led by the captain of the day, all knew at least some of the Bostonians in the street that night. Some were even married to locals. And yet that night someone yelled fire, and the soldiers fired their guns. In the end, I think we've let those guns deafen us to the true story of the Boston Massacre. We've gotten it wrong all those years. The Boston Massacre is actually a story of neighbors, not strangers. The real story is no less gripping, but it's a lot quieter and sadder. After the shooting, troops were redeployed elsewhere, and they and their families were faced with choices. Men could stay with their new Boston families. That was called desertion, and plenty did it. Women could stay in Boston while their husbands stayed with their regiments. That was called self-divorce. Or Massachusetts women stayed with their new husbands, embedded shards of Boston in the British Army. Those women rarely saw their natal families again. The ripping apart of families is the most significant impact of the Boston Massacre. And that leads me to my final point. How is the Boston Massacre a family history? Those who call the American Revolution a civil war portray the conflict as a clash of citizens, a struggle over the definition of a new country. But it would be no less accurate to call the revolution a sibling war. This conflict played out in the upheaval of innumerable families formed in a military occupation that often also tore them apart. Every family wrestled with that conflict in its own way, and every family was forced to make choices as difficult as they were inevitable. War, peacekeeping, and political administration brought together civilians and soldiers, men and women, children and godparents throughout the British Empire. Those same forces buffeted families and sometimes tore them apart as they moved around the Atlantic Rim. In an 18th century Anglo-American world, in which family and government were closely connected notions, the shooting in Boston marked not the beginning of the American Revolution, but the breakdown of a family. Prior to 1772, the language of family had long saturated British political discourse. But In the context of military families, it took on new and personal meanings. We think of the American Revolution as a political event, but it was much more like a bad divorce. This family history reminds us of the human bonds, as well as the political ones, that were broken at the beginning of the American Revolution. Thank you for listening to me talk about my book, and I look forward very much to hearing some of your questions on Twitter.